Hello and welcome to a Firstpost PoV. The much hyped meeting between Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping has ended in South Korea. Both the leaders met, they exchanged pleasantries and they held talks for 1 hour and 40 minutes. Afterwards, we've seen very different reactions from both sides. Trump appears to be quite upbeat about what happened. He says that the Chinese have agreed to buy a lot of energy, a lot of farm goods, and have also agreed to loosen this flow of rare earths from China into the US market. The Chinese, in their typical fashion, though, are being more measured in their response. They say that Trump has agreed to cut tariffs from 20% to 10%. This is over the fentanyl crisis that's brewing in America. The question is, does this meeting and what happened in those 1 hour and 40 minutes mark an end to this trade war between the Chinese and the Americans, or is this just a temporary pause before things flare up again? Let me put some of these questions to my guest, Meredith Crowley, who is a professor of international economics at Cambridge. Thank you so much, Professor, for speaking to us on Firstpost.
Thanks for having me.
We'll dive into the specifics later, but first, symbolically, just the fact that President Trump and President Xi were in the same room, that they held talks, that they exchanged pleasantries, will that at least calm the nerves in the markets and in the minds of the traders that this is not going to escalate even further?
Yes, I think this was a good step forward in that it's eased some of the extreme tension in a substantive way for the United States. There was quite a bit of real concern about Chinese restrictions on the exports of rare earth minerals. And so now that China's agreed not to impose those restrictions, the U.S. is going to be quite happy about that. That will reduce a lot of concern in markets about interference with high-tech manufacturing supply chains going forward.
At the end of that meeting, who do you think would have been the happier party leaving South Korea? Would it have been President Trump or President Xi? Very different reactions, but who got more from those talks, do you feel?
The United States, I think, was the winner in this, this specific meeting. More generally, I think the United States was successful in achieving a lot of the aims it had over the whole week it spent in Asia. So there was an agreement between the United States and Malaysia, another one between the US and Cambodia, and then a sort of joint statement by the US and Japan that they're going to work a little bit more together on basically what we could call industrial policy in securing rare earth minerals from countries other than China. So all of those were long-term objectives of the United States. These were concerns all the way back under the administration of President Obama, and there's been progress on all of these issues for the U.S. At the same time, I would say that President Trump went into the meeting with President Xi wanting to make President Xi look good in front of the Chinese people. So he wanted the leader to leave the meeting feeling that the United States was going to be a more measured and reasonable partner in helping China achieve some of the aims it has in its relationship with the U.S.
Right. Now, you said that United States would probably be more happier side after this meeting, which is interesting because I heard some experts say that China probably came to South Korea with a better hand to play because they had the chokehold on a strategically important resource in the form of rare earths. Would you agree with that assessment that China had the better hand? And if so, how did they not get more from these talks in South Korea? Where do you think it went perhaps a bit wrong for them?
Well, President Xi has a sort of one strong card to play, which is rare earths. But he also has a weakening domestic economy, and especially, among youth unemployment in China, high educated youth in China, there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the slowing of the Chinese economy. And so at some level, he really did need to have a reduction in American tariffs in a lot of goods in order to get Chinese merchandise flowing out of China and into other markets to keep the manufacturing economy in China working effectively. So although he had sort of this magic card with rare earths, if he was really going to play that and stop that sale to not just the United States, but other, important partners of the United States like Japan, like Germany, that wouldn't really have benefited him with his domestic population. So it's a little bit, he had a kind of risky hand. And I think what China's longer term aim in its relationship with not just the United States, but also its partners in other advanced economies that do a lot of technology work, is they want great access to high technology products like memory chips, but also software. They want their students to be able to come to other countries and study and work in universities. And he didn't get much progress on that kind of technological opening to China of other countries' advanced technologies.
So what would he ideally have to do to get that access and to get those tariffs cut even further? He gave some concessions on rare earth. The supply has been resumed for 1 year. It's a good start and it's a win for Donald Trump. What further can he do? Trump says the Chinese will buy a lot of American energy, a lot of American corn. Will that be enough to satisfy Trump and reduce more of these tariffs and get more of those US technologies flowing into China, or will he have to give up more?
I don't think the U.S. most advanced technologies are going to be going to China in any heavy level anytime soon. So I think this issue about soybeans with the United States, Donald Trump had this as an issue back in 2018, 2019. And at that time, the Chinese said, oh, we'll buy more American soybeans. And they never have, because they only buy what they actually need. So, full stop. I don't think President Trump really expects that to happen. And at some level, the concern in the United States and in other democratic countries with the sharing of advanced technology with China is that China does not practice democracy, and it is a quite controlled authoritarian regime. And so in general, democracies feel more comfortable sharing things with other democracies because they think that there's a sort of temperance that democratic societies aren't going to do really risky, dangerous things. And so I think that it's going to be very difficult for the U.S. To release these most advanced technologies to China. Over time, what could improve in China? A stronger commitment to rule of law and a stronger commitment to protecting intellectual property would allow for some, more advanced manufacturing techniques to make their way back to China. But I think that, the most cutting edge stuff is probably going to be restricted for, at least, 5-year horizon until the relationship changes more fundamentally.
We saw what you just mentioned play out with NVIDIA, where they created a separate class of chips to sell specifically in China instead of their more advanced ones. Would you say that is probably America's biggest card to play in these talks, the fact that they have access to this crucial technology that China desperately wants? Or would you say that the American market, the size and the prosperity of it that China's manufacturing sector requires to sell all of its stuff, would you say that is the Trump card? Which of these is Trump's bigger card to play here when it comes to China, the technology or the market access?
Well, it's a little bit 6 of one, half a dozen the other. They're both very important. I think what China understands it needs, if it wants to move from being an upper middle income economy to more advanced high income economy, is it does want more technology dissemination into China. If we look at China's history, from 2000 to say 2020, as China entered the global economy, it took huge amounts of inward investment from Europe, from Japan, from the United States. And this has hugely benefited the Chinese people. Between 2000 and 2020, about 800 million people in China, left dire poverty of less than $2 a day to higher levels of income. So this has been hugely beneficial for China and the world. However, it's a difference between, America wanting to share its more advanced manufacturing technologies for some types of products, these lower quality NVIDIA chips, but, things like, capital equipment to make other types of, manufactured goods, to share some robotic technology. I think that's something that will continue and is something where China and the U.S. can build a relationship. I think the issue has to do, especially, in the wake of the war between Ukraine and Russia, with how military technology is changing and what kinds of technologies in the consumer realm are going to have important military applications in the future. And I think that's a concern, and that type of technology will be more restricted, right. I expect.
Right. Now, beyond what happened in South Korea, President Trump is expecting a full trade deal with the Chinese. He says a deal is expected pretty soon. Is this a case of him overreading the situation and the talks that happened in South Korea? Because considering the geopolitical situation and the restrictions that you mentioned, the Americans are in no interest to sell these highly advanced chips or any sort of technology to the Chinese. And that context, is the idea of a full trade deal between the Americans and the Chinese just a non-starter right now?
Well, I think one of the things about President Trump is he likes to use words and make it sound like a big successful, issue has been achieved. But when you look at the details, it's often quite vague. So there's often this term, the phase one or the phase two deal that the former U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, negotiated with China in 2019. So these were, these earlier commitments that China was going to buy a lot of U.S. soybeans and other kind of not the most important issues. Those deals were signed. They're not really implemented. China never bought all the soybeans, the U.S. said it was going to, or that it said it was going to. That hasn't stopped President Trump from calling these fantastic deals. So I think that, after President Trump took office, he expanded U.S. tariffs to cover much more of Chinese trade. And this probably wasn't entirely in the interest of the American people. It wasn't in the interest of the Chinese people. He was sort of using this as a negotiating tactic. So now it would be entirely sensible for him to sign an agreement that undoes what he's done over the last, 6 or 8 months and put us back to the station, the spot where we were in right before he took office. He could call that a great trade deal, but it's a little bit silly in the sense that he's created some of the problems and then he unwinds those problems and says he's done fantastic things. So, he'll keep claiming he's doing great trade deals. And I think they may be associated with, significant improvements in the U.S.-China relationship, but they're not taking the U.S.-China relationship all the way back to what it was in, say, 2017, when there was considerably more trade between the two countries and more investment flowing. I don't think we're going back to that world under this administration or possibly even the next one that follows him.
So is it safe to then that this is the new normal in US-China relations, where going back to 2025 January when Trump took office is also not really a high point for US-China relations, like you mentioned. There were several restrictions, whether it's on rare earths or chips, that existed even then. Trump doubled down on them. So even if we go back to that, are we to say that this is the new normal when we'll see tariffs being lobbed at each other, restrictions being imposed, then perhaps taken back? Is this the new unstable order that we're looking at between America and China?
I don't think we're going to see tariffs going up and down a lot. I think that it's very likely that we're going to go back to what the world looked like in about December 2024. The U.S. is going to maintain these tariffs against China. These will be the tariffs that, President Trump initially put on China, that Joe Biden then thought were good and in the U.S.'s interest, and he kept on China. This covered about half of what the U.S. was importing from China. The other half was coming in without any more tariffs. That will probably settle and will probably be sort of left in that position. At the same time that the U.S.-China relationship on some ways is getting a bit stronger and healthier, these other things that were happening in Asia this past week are in some sense not very fortunate, not very advantageous for China. So for example, the agreement signed with Malaysia and the United States, the agreement signed between Cambodia and the United States, those make commitments on the part of Cambodia and Malaysia to maintain any kind of U.S. export restrictions of advanced technology to other countries. So it's left a little vague, but it clearly means the U.S. has said to Malaysia, if we ask you not to sell something to China, we want you to stand by us if we think that this has to do with our national security. Clearly, Japan is already very tightly aligned militarily with the United States. And the whole agreement over rare earths with Japan, the agreement to think about, jointly thinking about investment, about supply chains, that tightening of the U.S.-Japan relationship, that doesn't advantage China. So if we go back in time to a president that many people considered much more sober, and think about President Barack Obama, he had a policy that he called the pivot to Asia. And that meant he thought the United States should be deepening his ties economically, both through trade and investment, with Asia. And at the same time, he wanted to contain and isolate China because he didn't think that they were really playing by sort of fair multilateral rules. And he tried to pursue this through something called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Ultimately, there was a lot of work that went into it, but the United States didn't participate. Now, what Donald Trump has done is he's basically, through these agreements with Cambodia and Malaysia, he's resurrected that Barack Obama policy and is actually having some success in trying to reinstate this idea of we're going to get our Asian partners who are favorably inclined to the U.S. to help us contain China in some respect. So I would say that, the relationship between the U.S. and China, on the one hand, President Trump is trying to help President Xi look better and stronger to his domestic constituency. But at the same time, President Xi wasn't able to get these advanced technologies. And he's very aware of the fact that, other partners in Asia are deepening their ties to the United States. And that's not what China wants. China has, at the same time, been trying to expand its reach into its Asian neighbors through, agreements like the RCEP treaty. So RCEP is a treaty that builds a deeper coalition of trade engagement in the Pacific and in East Asia. And so that's been part of, China's outward diplomacy. It's trying to strengthen its relationships. So in some sense, Trump's success is a little bit of a step backward for China.
Right. I think what we saw yesterday in South Korea, at least, was a good signal in the sense that both these two countries, which are the two biggest economies in the world, have decided to at least sit down and talk instead of just lobbing tariffs at each other. You say that China will perhaps not be as happy as the Americans with what happened, considering that Trump gained in rare earth, as well as some promises on more on more Chinese energy, on more American energy and more American farm goods. Let's see how this deal and these promises are implemented, because implementation, of course, is a big part of how these deals will be resolved and how these conflicts will also be solved going forward. But thank you so much, Meredith, for speaking to us on First Post on these issues.
Thanks for having me.
Want the facts?
The latest developments?
News that gets straight to the point.
Well, we've got all three just for you. This is First Post Live, a brand new show, your window into what really matters.
Don't miss it.